Greetings everyone. Welcome to today's lecture on making of Indian Constitution. The concepts of the nation and the state grew as parallels in history. Nation indicated a collectivity of persons who have a certain bond with each other. State indicated a structured authority to rule over people in a certain territory. If we talk about Indian political thought, it has its own distinguishing features. It is closely linked to religion, social structure, ethics, so much so that it becomes extremely difficult to distinguish the political from other spheres of thought. There have been several Brahmanical and non-Brahmanical traditions which contributed to the evolution of political thought in India. And if we are talking about constitution and its meaning in contemporary times, we must also discuss as to how historically this idea evolved. So one can talk about Buddhists, Jains and later Muslims who came out with their own notions of good governance, duties, rights and obligations. It is true that early Indian thinkers did not develop political philosophy as an autonomous discipline. And to answer the question as to why they did not develop a systematic tradition of philosophy requires a critical examination of the Indian social structure and also a comparison with the social structure of classical Athens, where the tradition of political philosophy made its first appearance, and that too independently. Now, introducing the concept of constitution. What exactly is a constitution? A constitution symbolizes independence of a country. It refers to a framework and structure for the governance of a free country. The Constituent Assembly prepared the draft of the constitution by keeping the objectives resolution as the backdrop, which reflected the aspirations of the people of India, especially after almost 200 years of colonial rule. The framing of the constitution was completed on November 26, 1949, when the Constituent Assembly formally adopted the new constitution. However, the constitution came into force with effect from January 26, 1950. So, Indian Constituent Assembly, which was formed as a result of the discussions and deliberations between the Indian leaders and the members of the British Cabinet Mission, had its first formal meeting on December 9, 1946. What was the purpose of the assembly? The purpose was to present India with a constitution which would serve as a lasting principle, and hence selected a number of committees to explore an assortment of aspects of the projected constitution. The debates on the draft constitution were a very important part of the entire process. The draft constitution was presented to the Constituent Assembly on 4th November 1948 by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who was the chairman of the drafting committee. The draft constitution was now opened up for discussion in the assembly. So this is a very important aspect, that the present constitution that we have is not the result of simply a draft, but rather a number of debates that followed. The recommendations were debated, discussed and revised several times before the Indian Constitution was confirmed and officially adopted 3 years later on 26th November 1949. So a process that had started in 1946 finally ended after 3 years in 1949. And there were revisions of the draft constitution after several debates surrounding the draft constitution, the drafting committee proceeded to revise it in accordance with several decisions that had been made in the Constituent Assembly. This involved several tasks like renumbering articles, making minor changes to the language, then adding or removing certain clauses. The revised draft constitution was then submitted to the President of the Constituent Assembly on 3rd November 1949, and it was subsequently introduced in the Assembly. The Constitution begins with a preamble which declares India to be a sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic. The preamble also includes and in fact mentions the goals of securing justice, liberty and equality for its citizens, as well as the promotion of national unity and integrity on the basis of fraternity among the people, assuring dignity of the individual. Now, these are some very basic ingredients, and in fact, they can also be described as the soul of Indian Constitution. During the third reading of the draft constitution, there were only a few significant debates, and most of the speeches consisted of general comments on the constitution as a whole. And at the end of it, some members expressed satisfaction with the final version, while others still had several concerns. So, if we talk about Indian Constitution, we can say that it consists of two very important constituents. One is the government and the other is the people. So, if we talk about government, it definitely includes legislative powers, which means making laws, then judiciary, which indicates interpretation of laws that have already been formulated, and executive, which enforces the laws. And both at the receiving as well as at the giving end are the people. So, role of constitution is basically to define the relationship between government and its people. If we talk about the technical definition of constitution, it can be described as a set of fundamental principles or established precedents according to which a state or any organization is governed, and these rules together make up, that is, constitute what the entity is. And when these principles are written down into a single collection or a set of legal documents, those documents are known as a written constitution. Here, a very important observation can be made by Patrick Henry, whose lifespan was between 1736 to 1799. Now, as early as you can say 18th century, Patrick Henry made a very important statement, and that was, the Constitution is not an instrument for the government to restrain the people. It is an instrument for the people to restrain the government. So, this statement sums up that how the Constitution empowers its citizens, how it gives the right to citizens to keep a check on the government from time to time. If we have to trace the historical evolution of constitutional principles in India, then one can give an example of Ashokan edicts from 324 BCE to 185 BCE. One can outline the importance of Mauryan Empire and how several Ashokan edicts established some sort of principles for the 3rd century BCE. And the edicts of Ashoka were nothing but a collection of several inscriptions, as many as 33, on the pillars of Ashoka as well as on boulders and cave walls that were developed by Ashoka as a part of his principle of governance. As you can see on the screen, these are some of the examples, some of the fragments of his inscriptions that have been found on the pillars or on the rocks. Then each and every ruler had definitely some sort of principles which were the guiding force. Now coming to modern India and coming to the establishment of English East India Company's influence over India, especially from 1757 and 1765 onwards, when in 1765 East India Company became an administrative power and it gained the right of taxation in Bengal after defeating the Nawab of Bengal at the Battle of Plassey in 1757. So, if we talk about the history of Constitution of India, one can start tracing the developments that took place from 18th century itself. And while East India Company from 1765 to 1858, it tried to establish a unified control over the whole of India from a single center that was in Calcutta. Different acts and laws were enforced by East India Company during this time span so that the company could wield power, authority and some kind of legitimacy. However, the company came under increasing control by British Parliament and finally its rule ended with the revolt of 1857. And from then onwards, we see that many changes appeared, and from 1858 to 1947, one can describe it as the period of the British Raj. And it was during this time that the Constitution of India started taking shape. And there were several important stages that one can identify in this process. So, the first most important development was the Act of 1858, the Government of India Act 1858, which claimed that this act was for the better governance of India. This act put India directly under the control of British government. It set up the office of the Secretary of State, member of the British Parliament, who would be in charge of Indian government. In India, the Governor General working under the Secretary of State led the administration. The next major development was Indian Councils Act 1861, whereby a separate legislative council was set up to assist the Governor General in making laws. So, Indians could be appointed to the council but only on the discretion of the Governor General. The next important milestone was the Indian Councils Act 1892, as a result of which the sizes of the executive and legislative councils were increased. More Indians were appointed to these councils and the principle of election also was introduced. Now, all this was happening not because of some benevolent principle that the British government was following in India, but also as a result of the demands that were being raised from time to time by Indian leaders, especially after 1885 when Indian National Congress had been established. Then the next major development came in the form of Indian Councils Act 1909, which increased the sizes of the councils again, and it also gave the Legislative Council the power to discuss certain matters and to ask questions, and more people were elected to the councils. Then the Government of India Act 1919, which introduced the principle of diarchy, partial responsible government at the provincial level. Elected Indians were given charge of some areas of government. for example, industry, education, and all this was being done at the provincial level. The next important step was the Government of India Act 1935, which introduced provincial autonomy, responsible government at the level of provinces, with elected Indians in charge of the administration and responsible to the elected legislatures. A federal government was proposed, though it did not come into effect. At the center, diarchy was introduced. And finally, Indian Independence Act 1947. The British gave up control of the Government of India to two dominions, India and Pakistan. For the time being, till the Constitution was made, both of them would be governed in accordance with the Government of India Act 1935. So we see that the influence of Government of India Act 1935 continued to prevail on independent countries, both Pakistan and India, till the time they formally adopted their new constitution. Now, if we talk about the history of constitution, then we cannot but also mention the circumstances under which India got independence, and these were marked by large-scale riots and finally partition of the country. For the time till the constitution was made, India was to be governed in accordance with the Government of India Act 1935. The Assembly met in sessions open to the public for 166 days, which were spread over a period of 2 years, 11 months and 17 days, before finally adopting the constitution. It was finally passed and accepted on November 26, 1949. In all, the 284 members of the Assembly signed the official copies, which were original copies of the Indian Constitution. After several deliberations and some modifications, over 111 plenary sessions in 114 days, the 308 members of the Assembly finally signed two final copies of the document, one each in Hindi and English, on 24th January 1950. Same day, the Assembly unanimously elected Dr. Rajendra Prasad as the President of India, which came into effect on 26 January 1950, known and celebrated as the Republic Day of India. The Constitution was enacted by the Constituent Assembly on 26 November 1949, but it came into effect on 26 January 1950. Why? Because the date 26 January was chosen to commemorate the Purna Swaraj Declaration of Independence that had happened in 1930. With its adoption, the Union of India officially became the modern and contemporary Republic of India, and it replaced the Government of India Act 1935 as the country's fundamental governing document. Now, many conscious efforts were made to arrive to a consensus on several issues and principles, and also to avoid disagreement. The consensus came in the form of the objectives resolution that were moved by Jawaharlal Nehru in the Constituent Assembly as early as December 17, 1946, which was unanimously adopted by January 22, 1947. In the light of these objectives, the Assembly completed its task by November 26, 1949, and the Constitution was enforced with effect from January 26, 1950, and henceforward India became Republic of India. Now, this is a very important visual. The Constituent Assembly of India was elected to write the Constitution of India. Following India's independence from Great Britain, its members served as the nation's first parliament. This body was formed in 1946 for the purpose of making independent India's constitution, because it had become clearly visible to the colonial masters that no longer they would be able to continue as rulers. The assembly passed a resolution in 1947 January defining the objectives of the constitution. Now let us briefly look at what these objectives were. So one important objective was to set up a union of India comprising British India and the princely states. Then the next important objective was to set up a federal form of government with separate state and central governments. Some other objectives were to set up a democracy in which all power is derived from the people, where all people are guaranteed justice, equality and freedom, where minorities, depressed classes and the tribals' rights are protected. To protect the integrity of India and her sovereign rights over land, sea and air. To help India attain its rightful place in the world and work for peace and welfare of entire human race. Dr. Sachidanand Sinha was the first president, a temporary president of the Constituent Assembly when it met on December 9, 1946. Later on, Dr. Rajendra Prasad became the president of the Constituent Assembly and Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar became the chairman of the drafting committee on December 11, 1946. This is another very important visual which speaks volumes about the contribution of important leaders like Dr. Rajendra Prasad, then the president of the Constituent Assembly, and Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar, the chairman of the drafting committee, and Dr. Sachidanand Sinha. The Constituent Assembly consisted of 389 members, of which 292 were elected by the elected members of the provincial legislative assemblies, while 93 members were nominated by the princely states. To these were to be added a representative each from the 4 chief commissioners, provinces of Delhi, Ajmer, Marwar, Coorg and British Baluchistan. This is a visual of the first day of the Constituent Assembly. So, having discussed the process and how long drawn out procedure it was, you all will get a fair idea as to what were the ups and downs that the leaders must have gone through, the kind of debates that must have taken place, especially because the debates were even open to public. Thank you.